Hello and welcome to this module of your grant writing training. In this module, we'll be talking about using data to tell your story. Each nonprofit organization has a really unique and interesting story to tell their grant makers, so in this module, we'll be talking about the best way to do that. Just a tiny bit about me as a reminder, I'm a grant professional certified and an approved trainer of the Grant Professionals Association. Certainly doesn't mean that I have all the answers or that I have a silver bullet or a magic pill that will get all the grants, but rather, having been on both the grant making and the grant seeking side, love to share and talk with you about the competencies that can help improve the competitiveness of your work. As we go through this module focusing on our storytelling, we're going to begin by talking about the data that we can use to tell stories in our grant applications. You'll have my contact information at the end of each and every section of this module so that you can always reach out and ask any questions. As we think about the data that we use to tell stories, each of our grant applications can and should sound a little bit different because they are customized to our grant maker. They are helping us to think about why would this one particular grant maker want to say yes and fund us? And since each grant maker has a different purpose, a different goal, a different mission, the data that we select to tell this basic storyline, to present this basic formula that's on your screen right now, should and could probably be a little bit different. What we're trying to focus on is what is the problem or the need that we are working to address? What is the action? What are the activities? What are the programs or projects that we will implement in order to get to the final solution, the impact that we're hoping to create? So when we think about what data we might select to tell the stories in our grant application, we're thinking about how do we tell this story of this formula to a grant maker that has unique ideas about why they fund, who they are as an organization. Now let's be clear. Your basic answer to this formula on the screen, what is the problem or need? What are the actions, the activities, and what is the solution or the impact? Your basic story, it stays the same. You shouldn't be changing who you are in order to apply for grants. Rather, what we want to focus on in this section is by thinking about what data out of all the data and all of the stories and all the great testimonials that we have, all our great results, based on all those things, what are the best few for us to select to tell this particular grant maker about our story? That's where we'll begin our conversation. Now, how can we do that? How can we ensure that it is a consistent approach within our applications? What I've done is lay out 5 consistent steps that your organization can take in trying to determine what data, what approach should we take in telling our stories. So the first thing to do is review the guidelines of the different grant makers so that we can consider our options. We then look at the application structure to think about what do we have? Short, long spaces in which to tell our story and share the data. We'll be thinking about what types of stories we might utilize. We might even practice our story out loud to see how others react, and then eventually, finally, we would start writing. Let's think about some of those first steps together. If we're reviewing the guidelines and the public information of a grant maker, what might we find? Well, certainly, we're going to read all the formal guidelines, whether it's one PDF page or 101 PDF pages, we will read the entire set of guidelines from the grant maker. That might have some very specific information requested, specific types of data that are expected by the grant maker when you put together your application. But there's one more spot that we need to do some research in order to understand what choices we might make. That's the public information that the grant maker might make available. So the example on the screen is from the New York State Council on the Arts. That is a state funding agency that does indeed publish very formal, extensive guidelines about their requirements and expectations for a grant application. And yes, that does give us some clues about what we should be including. But by also looking at the public information, in this case, an example from a Facebook post, what we can learn are the types of stories that they, as a granting organization, like to highlight about those they have funded. By seeing both the visuals, in this case we've got a picture, we're seeing the story of those that were supported, we can start to get a sense for the personality and the preferences of the grant maker. What type of information is it that they highlight and they share? And then we can compare that to what we already have and think about what will be our best choice, what will be our best story, what will be our best data, what will be the best way to present who we are and what it is that we propose to do. Once we've done that, it's time to look at the application itself. What is the length that we have been provided to respond to the specific questions, if there were any guidelines formally provided at all? Okay, you're right. Most of the time we're going to have very formal expectations related to the questions we answer and the length that we have to answer those questions in. So for example, if we were to continue along that example with the New York State Council on the Arts, what we would find is an online portal. We would find questions that are specifically about the community benefit. So for those that are going to be served in the proposed project or program, how were they involved in the creation of this? How will they be solicited for input during the program, after the program? The questions that we see asked in the application, when paired with what we've read in the broad guidelines about their goal and purpose for the funding, and what we see them highlighting about past and recent grantees, is starting to give us a good outline and some good clues about what we might include. Now we can think about what do we have and how does it align with what we have seen from our grant maker. So what types of stories might we use? What sort of data and testimonials might be available to us? So from what we could see in this example, things that are community stories, things that are about the impact of our work on our broader community, our broader region, maybe even the whole state, would be the best fit here. How do we tell those stories? We might think about what are we gathering in terms of our ongoing evaluation tools? What are the different mechanisms that we'll be collecting individual stories, group stories, longer term impact stories? What is it that we'll have available? The centering piece to this portion of the process is that the community impact, that is the biggest thing that our grantee or I should say our grant maker wants us to focus on. So within what we already have the capacity to complete, what is it that might be available that would help us talk about community stories? Impact we've already created that we could use as proof for our future proposed impact. This is where then, as we're gathering all these pieces, it's like we have a jigsaw puzzle and we're gathering each piece of information and laying it out on the table to determine what is the story we're going to tell. It's probably a good idea to test it out on a stakeholder. You're right, you're probably not going to get to verbally test it out on the grant maker themselves, but what about a leader in your organization, or a board member, or a family member, a friend, another grant professional colleague that you're not going to be competing against? Can you share what your theory is? What is the story that you want to share? What data do you have? And see what resonates. See what questions they have or what suggestions they might have. Maybe they're looking for some more context related to the data you're going to use to present your overall story. Listen to the feedback from those individuals so that you can get to the writing portion and think about how will I take the data I've gathered that's about our own work, about the impact we've created, about what we know about our community. How can we present that in a way that best answers all of our questions and helps to tell the story? Now, of course, when we think about character and word limits, that might put some constraints on our actual responses. It's part of why, though, we take those first 4 steps before we stress or focus on our writing. If we can think about our overall story that we would like to tell, if we can look at the type of data and the types of stories that we have available that might align with what's important or what might resonate with the grant maker, now, instead of looking at an individual response from a very narrow lens, we're rather looking at each of the responses available to us and thinking about, how do I place this larger story into the responses, into the limits that I have available to me at this time? When we're looking at the data and what we're going to try and include, so there's a lot that you might pull from, isn't there? Maybe an overwhelming amount. The idea that we're trying to tell a community story. I don't mean only a quoted story from a community member, a quoted testimonial. That might be part of what we're thinking about. But we might also be thinking about some of the demographic information that helps paint the picture for a potential grant maker about our community, about our region, our county, our town, our village. We may need to rely on some really big primary data sources, maybe things like the Census Bureau, certainly. We might be relying on local needs assessments, maybe something conducted by a community college or a United Way. We'll be pulling from a number of different data sources in order to put together the clearest picture, in this case, of a community story. The whole community, not just individuals that we will be serving, but rather the broadest of the community definitions that we can present. Don't forget to make sure that you're giving strong context for the information so that a grant maker who might not be familiar with your community you're proposing to serve, so that they understand, how does this information compare to what's happening in other communities, in the larger region, in the larger state. And as you're thinking about the data that you're going to use, as you're thinking about maybe some of those potential character limits, if you have to leave out any of the data that you've gathered, which data points are the most closely related to your proposed outcomes, to the overall impact? Those would be the data pieces that should get priority in your writing work. As you're looking at the data, as you're thinking about the stories, please remember that your grant makers, well, they come from a wide range of backgrounds and experiences. And yes, they are qualified to be reviewers. But you need the information you present to be as relatable to all reviewers as possible. And you should be thinking, therefore, about the different ways to appeal to the different senses of a reviewer. Different reviewers have different ways that they engage with the written work, that they think about the priority type of work that you're doing. And so how can you appeal to the different senses and emotions of those people, the individuals who are reading your written work? Lastly, of course, there's a lot of layers to this. You also need to make sure that you are using your individual grant makers' funding priorities, that you're using that as a lens as well. If you had to set any information, set any part of the data, any part of the story to the side, maybe again because of a character limit, how would we decide between 2 pieces of information, 2 parts to the story? I would let the alignment of the piece of data with our funders' priorities, I would let that be the deciding vote. This is about presenting the best customized story to a specific grant maker. And so that should be the final deciding factor when you're looking at, is this information relevant, helpful? Do I have space for it? Can I make space for it? If it helps more closely align your written work to the organization's priorities from that grant maker, go for it. Make sure you find the space for it. One thing that I want to point out, and this is something that is important when it comes to formatting. When possible, given that reviewers interact with, digest, and review information from a wide range of perspectives and backgrounds, some grant makers certainly are more inclined to digest, to engage with material that is presented both in text and visual format. Therefore, if formatting allows, which I know that's a huge if formatting allows, what sort of imagery could you provide? What sort of visualization for the data, for the story could you present? Now, what's on the screen? There's a lot of information in that one image square, isn't there? Yes, there is. So if you're going to include any sort of visual to help tell your story, to make the data you're presenting a little less complex, a little easier for your reviewers to digest, my recommendation is that you go with a single message. What is the single takeaway that you want from this image? What is the single message you want to be taken away from this table or this chart or this graph? Try to simplify the message that is being presented through the image, through the figure, through the chart. And of course, label it within the text so that you can reference it out of the narrative and connect the dots. Why are we showing you this visualization? I don't know about you though. I talk about images, I talk about visualizations, I talk about charts and figures. I love creating a great chart, a little pie chart, a bar graph out of Excel, or even Google Sheets. Take it any further than that, and I am so far out of my comfort zone. So one of the things that might help you as you're trying some different ideas might be a tool like Canva. It's free for nonprofits, and so while we're not affiliates, it's something that I've found to be a great resource if you're trying to get a little bit more creative than what you might be able to do in Excel or Google Sheets. Now, of course, as I mentioned, that is all about if formatting is going to allow. And as we wrap up this section of our module and we're thinking about the data that we're trying to gather in order to tell our story, the reality is we're just getting started in thinking about our story and what it's going to sound like and look like for each unique grant maker. But if you have a question about this particular module, please be sure to drop me an email, Diane@dhleonardconsulting.com, so we can get your questions answered. And regardless, I can't wait to see you in the next section of this module.